Hello, everyone.
Good.
Welcome to today's webinar. We'll wait for a few more people to log on, and then BJ will kick us off.
Good afternoon, everybody. Glad you could join. Like she said, we'll give a minute and we'll get on with the program. Connie, thank you for doing it. Nora, let me know when you're ready.
I'm ready to go whenever you feel like we have our critical mass.
Nora, ready to go? Nora?
Yeah, all good over here.
All right. Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Vijay, Innovation Officer of Metals Innovation Initiative. Many of you know me. I have here with me Mike Buckington, CEO of Metals Innovation Initiative, previously CEO of Logan Aluminum till October. When he retired, this December, he started as CEO of MI2. Very excited to have you all here and welcome. Um, we have a very exciting session. Energy, clean and affordable. Clean energy is a topic for all of us. Many of you participated in various energy sessions for Metals Innovation Initiative. Some of you probably this is the first time you're engaging with it. We have an exciting session lined up with an expert in environmental, social, and governance science with West Virginia University, and a career dedicated to the intersection of business and sustainability. Connie brings a wealth of knowledge and experience to this conversation. I've known Connie from not just MI2. She interacted. She works with Game Change with the University of Kentucky and Vanderbilt and University of Tennessee Engine. From her early work in environmental research, monitoring greenhouse gases with NOAA and studying vegetative reclamation to pioneering sustainability reporting tools and supply chain stewardship solutions. Connie has been at the forefront of ESG innovation. She has helped businesses navigate complex regulatory landscapes, identifying risks and uncovering opportunities in rapidly evolving economy. I'm very fortunate to have Connie, my two work closely with all four. Connie, I'll let you add anything on all four introduction and introduce a little more. Thank you very much for doing that. With that, I'll turn it around to Connie.
Thank you, Vijay. And thank you everyone for being here. As Vijay mentioned, I am with an organization called ALL4, headquartered out of the Philadelphia office. We have a global footprint and focus on all aspects of environmental stewardship. We have an air quality practice, we have the sustainability practice, which I lead. We have a digital services practice as well as an EHS practice. And we partnered with MI2, which we felt very lucky for that opportunity, to put together the study looking at clean energy supply availability for metals manufacturers in Kentucky. And the goal was to quantify 10% clean energy increase over 5 years and looking at possible pathways to achieve that. As everyone on this call knows very well, metals manufacturing is energy intensive. And so it's dependent on reliable, safe, affordable, and sustainable energy at a price point consistent with global competitiveness in order for them to be able to thrive and grow. If you think about, and again, probably not news to this crowd, but where metal industries have thrived historically has been near sources of abundant, affordable energy like coal. But as the market changes and we move towards other forms of energy, it is important to ensure that that supply is available to Kentucky's metals manufacturers so they are not limited in their ability to grow within the Commonwealth. the only thing that coal didn't provide in that list of things is sustainability. So it's as far as being a sustainable source. And so as the market is changing and the world is moving towards those cleaner energy sources, there are market pressures at work. And then just to give a little bit of context around the metals, the intensity of the metals industry from an energy perspective, here's some information about how much energy the industry is consuming presently. And of course, when we think about energy, it's not just electricity, but it's also other forms of, for example, fuels that the specific facility might use. So we kind of look at BTUs and megawatts, in some cases interchangeably, but as measurements of that energy consumption and the reliance on affordable sources. So when we think about 10% of clean energy over the next 5 years, from the historical consumption perspective, we would be thinking about somewhere around 2,000 megawatt hours. But of course, we're already looking at we did circulate a survey, and most of the membership is looking at growing and expanding. So as we're thinking about 5 years from now, that number is likely to be bigger. But that's an important thing to note, that we did we circulated a survey to the membership, asking some questions to help us with this report, and we will look at some of that data as we go along. Thinking about the current energy mix in Kentucky, probably no surprise, the majority coming from coal, and coupled with natural gas, that puts it around 80% of fossil fuel dependency from an energy generation perspective. There is some hydro and biomass as well, but as far as the overall mix, pretty small amount coming from renewable sources or clean sources, and we'll talk a little bit about the distinction there. But compared to overall in the United States, generally nationally, we're using much less coal than is specific to Kentucky, though not a huge difference in renewable energy. Now, these numbers are from 2021, and a lot has come online since then. So that renewable energy piece of the pie has grown significantly nationally, but not as significantly within Kentucky. And as I mentioned, we're talking about we can be talking about electricity, or we can be talking about other types of energy. But specifically, when you're thinking about electricity, it's important to understand the complexity of the grid, not only in the Commonwealth, but this is true in most parts of the United States as well. Although, as you're probably aware, Texas has kind of its own grid and things are a little bit different there. But the kind of takeaway here is that there are a lot of players, and depending on where your facility is in the state, you may have some combination of a generator, a transmission provider, a substation, and a distribution, which is basically your kind of your retail outlet. So there are complications and constraints about having so many players in the grid, which makes it more difficult in some places and less difficult in others to transition to a clean energy portfolio. What is clean energy? So thinking about what we can consider kind of available to us when we think about clean energy, it generally refers to electricity or thermal energy. Again, that can be fuels coming from fuels, can be produced with relatively fewer externalities during some or all parts of the life cycle. So it can include renewable or non-renewable sources. Renewable sources might be electricity can come from solar or wind. Non-renewable sources of electricity include nuclear, but still clean electricity. Renewable fuel sources can include renewable natural gas or biomass. Non-renewable fuel can be natural or green hydrogen. So there's a lot of different options depending on what the specific needs of a facility are. And some of these are more advanced than others, and we'll dig into that a little bit. But externalities can include greenhouse gas emissions, air pollution, water pollution, solid or hazardous waste, or other costs that are not borne by the source, but are borne instead either by ecosystems or other stakeholders who don't have control over those sources. So why is more clean energy important? As we think about market demand, there is a big, specifically in the metals value chain, a big movement towards sourcing lower carbon, lower embodied carbon metals. And that market demand is going to favor those sources that have a lower carbon footprint because they have used cleaner energy to produce the metals or the products. And so if we look at various aspects of the value chain for specifically on the consuming side, the buyers of metals, whether it be construction, auto, tech, beverages, or energy, we see a lot of push. Specifically, the net zero steel members are going to be in particular looking for those lower carbon products, but as well looking at reducing scope 3 emissions where you are supplying to one of these buyers, and so you are part of their scope 3. And so having that lower carbon product available is a competitive advantage. More clean energy is also important because we are seeing regulatory changes globally. So if you are importing specifically iron, steel, or aluminum into the EU, you are subject to the what you might have heard CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. Other jurisdictions are considering this as well. We'll see some are getting closer to things like carbon taxes, but this is the most mature carbon border adjustment mechanism that is currently active. And so what that means right now, they're still in the transition period. So it's a data collection period. So you are having to provide, and many of you may have heard this from your clients. I'm working with somebody who supplies to Airbus, and Airbus is asking for this information from them in terms of the embodied carbon of the metal pieces that they sell to them. So you may be hearing from your European clients asking for this information. It will eventually turn into a fee that is applied on essentially the delta between the carbon footprint baseline that the EU determines versus the carbon footprint of that specific product. The goal here being to level the playing field for companies who are investing in lower carbon products and not giving an advantage to products that aren't making that investment. Clean energy is also important because more energy in general is important. And grid demand growth across the country is expected to accelerate. And it just depends. I didn't even put up a specific percentage here because depending on who you're listening to, it's very wide. Everybody generally agrees growth is going to accelerate. It had been flat for many years between a combination of demand was increasing, but efficiency was improving. But now with a lot of things, affecting the energy demand, electrification, and I'm sure we're all tired of hearing about AI and how that's going to burden the grid. But there's a lot, and at the same time, we have an aging infrastructure here in the U.S. So that building capacity to be able to deliver to meet peak demand load as it changes quickly is going to be something that is going to be a challenge. And there will probably be winners and losers. And that we do have other things available to us. And I'll talk a little bit more about energy efficiency, but we probably could supply enough if we wasted less. And that's not just at the end user perspective, but as energy moves through the system. We're also curtailing a lot in certain areas where there is too much energy for the current load demand. And so there are things that can be done within the existing infrastructure, but generally speaking, it's well understood that there's going to have to be significant investment in building out the grid in the United States. And depending on where you are in the country, that can be very different. If you're looking at, for example, the Northern Virginia corridor, where there is a lot of data center activity happening, interconnections to the grid can take years. And with certain parts of Kentucky, they are part of PJM, which has one of the worst backlog queues for interconnection. So if you are trying to site a new facility and attach to the grid or even increase capacity, there can be delays due to that grid infrastructure and the generation capacity available. So as that as that infrastructure is built out, those costs will be passed on to ratepayers in one way or another. So that, coupled with the fluctuation, the volatility of fossil fuel prices, makes for a lot of pricing uncertainty. And so when we're thinking about things like solar or wind that have a zero marginal cost, where there is investment in those, there can be a lot more certainty to long-term pricing. In Kentucky in particular, there are constraints that are unique to the Commonwealth. Not that they don't happen anywhere else, but that aren't necessarily true everywhere. And so that includes things like net metering restrictions. So if you are to invest in generation behind the meter, you can only sell a small percentage of that back to the energy provider, which impacts, in some cases, the ROI and makes the project not as it makes it the economics harder to justify. There isn't a renewable portfolio standard in Kentucky. You can see on this map here states that do have that renewable portfolio standard. And what that means basically is that the state is mandating that providers are providing certain percentages and increasing percentages of clean energy to the grid over time. So what can happen then when providers are selling to multiple states, for example, they will prioritize sending clean energy to states that do have a renewable portfolio standard so that they're in compliance with that, and then sending less clean sources to states that do not have that requirement in place. And so that makes it that much harder to look at organic greening of the grid, as we are seeing generally across the United States, that over time the grid is getting cleaner, but that will be at a pace that is hindered in states that do not have that renewable portfolio standard. We also see a lot of not a lot, but there's legislation in Kentucky that is definitely more favorable of fossil fuel, specifically coal. SB 349, relatively recent development, makes it much harder to decommission coal plants, even if they are past their usable life. So we'll be seeing those kinds of regulations also slowing down clean energy availability from the grid in Kentucky. I just want to say real quickly, if people have questions, feel free to put those in the chat. This study was done by several people in our group, not just me. So there might be questions that I can't necessarily answer, but we will certainly get back to you on them. But if I can't answer them, I will. So as we're thinking about this changing landscape and a transition to a low carbon economy and low carbon energy, what are those emerging clean energy levers? So there are things that are emerging that definitely are closer or already actively commercialized. So for example, electric arc furnaces, we're seeing a lot more electric arc EAF technology being used in metals manufacturing, molten oxide electrolysis, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the next slide. But that is the company that's mainly developing this, called Boston Metal. That will be commercially available in 2026. When we think about longer term, nuclear and hydrogen are options. But when we think about the next 5 years, which was the goal of this report, 10% in 5 years, nuclear and hydrogen are unlikely to be a significant option within that time frame, but certainly longer term. So I'm sorry. There are demonstration sites of this molten oxide electrolysis, what Boston Metal is calling green steel. And like I said, expected to reach commercial scale by 2026. The molten oxide electrolysis, or MOE, removes carbon from the oxidation process. So no carbon dioxide production from the combustion of coal or other fossil fuels. And it can convert all iron ore grades to high quality liquid metal. So that liquid iron through the process. It gets very, very hot, 16,000 Celsius. I'm sorry, 1600 degrees Celsius. And that causes the electrons to split the bonds in the iron oxide in the ore. And that's how that process produces pure liquid metal. Of course, there is processes after that have to happen to get to steel, but this does give that carbon-free process to go from the ore to the liquid iron. So what are currently available clean energy levers? Again, thinking about that 5-year time frame. As I mentioned early on, we did do a survey of the membership, so we will look at some of the respondents here. And so thinking about clean energy from the grid, as I said, organically in the United States, generally speaking, the grid is greening, but you are also in certain cases able to purchase green energy specifically through power purchase agreements. And renewable natural gas. So there is work being done specifically in Kentucky, converting or by utilizing bourbon feedstock to produce natural gas. And there's also a lot of landfill generated natural gas available. And so if you are able to access that, so it's delivered through a pipeline the same way other natural gas is. And so proximity to the source is kind of important, but that is an option that is currently available. As I mentioned, the power purchase agreements, they can be physical, financial, or virtual. It gets kind of complicated depending on what market you're in and what can be offered in terms of the physical power purchase agreements where you're actually getting those electrons, as opposed to virtual power purchase agreements, which is very similar to the concept of renewable energy credits. So where you're essentially kind of paying for projects that are happening in other areas, and then you are kind of taking credit for that as opposed to actually using that energy. And that's, so the virtual power purchase agreements and the renewable energy credits are sort of similar. Now with renewable energy credits, you are actually buying the credits themselves. That doesn't change what happens on your site in terms of what's coming out of the stack or the electricity you're using, but it does provide financing for other sorts of clean energy projects. So it has a role to play. Energy efficiency, as I mentioned before, there are a lot of opportunities for reducing energy consumption simply through taking advantage of efficiency measures. Waste heat recovery, because the metals manufacturing requires such high temperatures, waste heat recovery can be a very good opportunity to increase energy efficiency. Half of our respondents to the survey are utilizing waste heat. I've seen several different case studies that really demonstrate the return on investment with waste heat recovery. So it can be something, if you're not currently practicing, to take a look at. On-site generation and storage is currently available. There are several examples across the Commonwealth, as well as across the country, where on-site generation typically is going to be solar, but it can also, depending on what your site's like, wind, which isn't as big of an option in Kentucky, but it can be geothermal or sometimes where a facility has that proximity or has their own source of renewable natural gas, that can also be on-site generation. Coupled with the storage, particularly when you're talking about intermittence, such as solar or wind, where, if it's nighttime or the wind's not blowing, you're not generating electricity, storage becomes very important to provide that flexibility and to make sure that the energy is more dispatchable. So of our respondents, 14% have considered, or I'm sorry, 86% have considered on-site generation, and 29% and 71%, excuse me, I'm getting my purple and pink mixed up, and 71% have space for it, because it certainly does take up room. And we'll dig into that a minute in the next slide. But thinking about the advantages of on-site generation, The prices are coming down. We'll look at that in a little bit more detail. There are incentives currently available. Obviously, we are seeing a lot of change at the federal level in terms of what incentives will be available, but there are incentives through specific utility providers, as well as some at the state level. And MI2 does a fantastic job of maintaining a database of those kinds of incentives. So I would definitely take advantage of that. Time to access. So again, when we're thinking about a 5-year time frame, you are going to have much better luck installing solar with storage than you would, for example, looking at nuclear or hydrogen. Pricing certainty. So that is when you are doing your own on-site generation. Again, if you are using something like solar, very low marginal costs. So you can plan out very well for into the future against the life cycle of your panels and the efficiency over time, what those costs will look like. But there is a certain, there's maintenance that goes into that. You will at some point have to replace different panels, but it's all very well defined. And as time goes on, those panels are getting cheaper, at least has been historically the case. And we'll look at some numbers around that. Barriers to on-site generation that we heard from the survey. The number one reason was access to capital. It's not cheap to put in solar. The upfront cost is coming down significantly, but is still considerable. And so getting those projects funded, particularly when you're looking at something like over a 3-year ROI, you're not going to get a 3-year ROI probably. So it has to have a little bit more generous payback time in order to, in some cases, make that business case. Lack of public policies driving economies of scale. So that's one of the things when we go back to thinking about the renewable portfolio standards, by having those policies in place, then at the utility level, you will see the implementation, which makes it much more cost effective for the ratepayers to be able to participate in those clean energy generation schemes. And so where there is not that public policy driving those large investments, the price can be too high for sort of individual businesses to try and implement some of these solutions. And space constraints. So certainly solar panels take up room, and to have enough to generate for your entire facility is probably not realistic, but for that 10% is definitely a possibility. So if we think about annual consumption being 31 million kilowatts, which we asked our survey participants, and that's sort of an average between the responses that we got. And of course, as I mentioned, they consistently indicated that they will have significant energy use increase by 2030, but we're going to use that number for now. And so to think about clean energy, increasing clean energy by 10% or 3.1 million million kilowatts, on-site solar would require about a 2.2 megawatt solar system. Then adding storage would provide that additional flexibility. Utility scale solar systems, which this would be, even though it's commercial, but it would be utility scale, it's roughly around $1 million a megawatt. And so when you think about the self-generation benefits over time to do your ROI, keep those numbers in mind. But this is for the short term, one of the most accessible solutions, assuming that electrification is feasible for your particular facility. Now, I know that certainly a lot of you are using fuels as well, but where either processes can be electrified or you can substitute the electricity that you're using for clean electricity, self-generated. That is, as I said, the sort of the nearer term option. So just again, some evidence that this can be done. Rolls-Royce Power System, that's in Aiken, South Carolina. And this aligns with the numbers that we were just talking about. So they have a 2 megawatt solar system and a 1 megawatt battery storage system. They also have a 300 kilowatt backup diesel generator, but in talking with them, they have very little use for that, and their system with the battery backup has been very reliable. Just in Kentucky, we have an example of at R.A. Jones, where they put in a 1.7 megawatt solar system and along with 6 EV charging stations. So there is, evidence that this can be done, and good business cases that that data is available as well. So getting into kind of key findings, which we've sort of been touching on throughout, as I mentioned, the cost of solar is coming down significantly, and at the same time, efficiency is going up. So the technology is getting better. Solar panels are getting cheaper. We have successfully started to at least invest in having supply chain domestically. Currently, though, most solar equipment, at least the panels, is still coming from China, but we're seeing there had been a lot of investment in solar panel manufacturing in the United States. We'll have to keep an eye on that. But anyway, cost is coming down. And so in the near term, that can be a very viable option. When you think about the levelized cost of energy, of considering the lower costs of both the solar panels and the batteries, it's really moving towards a parity with other sorts of energy sources, including what you pay from your grid provider. So there's also, again, thinking beyond the 5-year timeframe, nuclear technology is really, there's so much exciting things happening, and I'm a big fan of fusion. We'll see, fission, and we'll see where we get with that. But that's probably a little further out. But we are seeing a lot of options with small modular reactors and other types of nuclear technology that is coming onto the market. And we're also seeing a lot of activity around utilization of former coal sites. So this particular project here, where there's the rendering drawing, is a project in Wyoming that they are utilizing a former coal plant or coal generation facility and converting it to sodium fast reactor. They're retrofitting that. And there's so many good reasons for doing that. Obviously, first of all, you have, as Kentucky well knows, these so-called energy communities that are very negatively impacted when a power plant goes offline. And so the ability to maintain that community with jobs, as well as the availability of electricity, is a huge bonus. And by reusing that site, we talked some about interconnection queues and things like that, you are able to eliminate those sorts of wait times because the interconnection already exists. And in certain cases, there's other things, there's supply routes and other infrastructure that you can take advantage of by retrofitting these sites. So that is definitely something to keep an eye on. That could be good for not only the metals manufacturers in Kentucky, but the Commonwealth as a whole. Also, super important to engage with your state and federal delegations, getting those policies in place that favor the swift development of clean energy. So thinking about, again, pressing it at the state level to have a renewable portfolio standard put in place will make that grid energy more, clean energy more available from the grid. But also thinking about some of those federal incentives that have been successful in the recent past, and keeping those in place in order to continue to build up the domestic infrastructure and supply chain, where we are able to continue to do research for the nuclear options, and have plants that are producing solar panels domestically, and other parts of that supply chain that had largely historically moved offshore and concentrated primarily in China and other Asian countries. So from a competitive and energy security standpoint, it's important that we're not reliant, that we are able to do those things domestically, but also for availability of clean energy in the Commonwealth. And MI2, obviously, their role is not they are 501c3, so they are not engaging or lobbying politicians or their delegations for these things, but they do a great job with development of educational resources, studies, and other available information, and to provide that support to the membership seeking to access clean energy is something that we do recommend that they continue doing. Other recommendations, so if you're thinking about on-site actions, like I said, energy efficiency is always a great place to start. The less you waste, the less you have to pay for, the less you need. And then that gap becomes available for growth. Electrification where possible. When you read the report, we definitely acknowledge that electrification is not always possible for all processes for different metals manufacturers, but where possible, that electrification allows for a lot greater efficiency, as well as the opportunity to move away from from heavier polluting energy sources. On-site generation and storage, that really kind of is our main recommendation, that looking at a 10% increase in availability of clean energy over the next 5 years for those facilities that have the space for it and are able to make that business case. That's going to be kind of the quickest path. Alternative fuels are also an option. We talked a little bit about renewable natural gas. So thinking about clean energy, so when you burn methane that came from a landfill or came from manure or came from, bourbon production, it still does the same thing in the atmosphere, right? So still where there's leaks and that methane is directly getting into the atmosphere, or when you combust it, CO2 is a byproduct, that's still going to happen on the back end. But on the front end, you aren't, the impact is much less because you aren't, first of all, you're not drilling for virgin natural gas, but also if that gas was not captured from a landfill, for example, it would go into the atmosphere. And yes, it's being converted to CO2, but CO2 is a much less potent greenhouse gas than CH4. So overall, in balance, that renewable natural gas is a very good alternative. We're seeing more happening with hydrogen. Hydrogen was all the rage. There was a lot of money being thrown at it over the last few years. The problem I always had with hydrogen was that, it either comes from methane, which is its own problem, or it comes from water, which I think that we will see, and it has to be like clean water and good water. So, I think that going forward, water and being from the West is more and more of an issue. And so, utilizing that to bust the molecule up for the hydrogen is not necessarily, I don't think a sustainable path forward. But we are seeing more and more geologic hydrogen being found. So as that, and there's all kinds of colors of hydrogen, right? So that's considered natural or white hydrogen, where that is an opportunity, and there is infrastructure being built from a pipeline perspective. Hydrogen has other issues with transport and things like that. So again, if you're sort of near a source and that pipeline infrastructure is in place, hydrogen obviously likes to burn. So it's a alternative, and the combustion of hydrogen results in water. So it is a much cleaner burning fuel, certainly. We talked about purchase of renewable energy credits. That is an option that, again, that's the good thing about renewable energy credits, is that they do provide financing for investments in clean energy. It doesn't change the absolute profile depending on the accounting. It can change the net profile of emissions, but it is certainly a viable option. Utility company collaborations. So we're seeing this more and more in different markets. So I definitely encourage you to talk to your utility provider. We did ask the question in the survey, and it does seem like there's a lot of opportunity for the membership to engage more heavily with their utility companies to say, hey, what's available? And yes, we're interested in this. And, kind of put some pressure on them to see what plans they have in place and how they can help achieve the goal of, 10% increased availability of clean energy. And then the legislative engagement, like I said before, be talking to your senators and your representatives, both at the state and federal level, and pushing for those policies, those industrial policies that help to not only support the clean energy industry, but also doing it in ways like we talked about before, where it is not leaving those energy communities behind, but instead giving them a new thing to support their community with jobs and with energy availability. So those two things are absolutely not mutually exclusive. They're not at odds. And there's a lot of good evidence and case studies of where that has been successful. So I would also encourage you to read the integrated resource plans from your provider. TVA, which services some of the Commonwealth, has a really, really good example of integrated resource plans. Some of the other ones are very not nearly as good. And so again, when you're engaging with your utility providers, you can talk to them about those integrated resource plans and how they can align with your expectations going forward. So that's a good place to source some information. The full report is available. I will leave that to the MI2 team to talk about how and when that's going to be distributed. I know that's just going to be shared with the membership. And there's a lot more information in there. There's some kind of neat case studies just to give you some ideas of where things are being successful and just more in-depth information. So, have a look at that, and certainly feel free to reach out to me if you have any specific questions. I don't know, do we have any? Let's see if we have any questions in the chat. Okay, so BJ, looks like you answered that one. Okay, so let's see. Are the solar energy incentives changing for better or worse with the administration change? It's not going to be good. There is definitely, and reading different things. So the new head of the DOE actually is very pro-nuclear and geothermal. As far as the solar incentives go, there is definitely a lot of, I think, effort.
Incentives for. Will there be incentives for nuclear? Sorry, I didn't realize we were not muted.
Oh, that's okay. Well, yeah. So that is my expectation. Just reading about the head of the DOE, and I don't, it's just so hard to say right now because there is certainly research funding going into nuclear through our national labs, Sandia and Los Alamos. They're doing a lot of research, and they partner with industrial partners for that. So there is incentive there, and there has been historically the last several years, DOE doing a lot of grants and prizes for nuclear technology advancement. I don't know how that's going to play out going forward. Like I said, just from what I've read, the new head of DOE is very pro-nuclear. We have heard the president express support for nuclear. So I guess we will see where that lands. But there's a lot of traction just in the private sector as well, with technology development, not just in the United States, but globally. And some of these technologies, like the small modular reactors, are quite commercial ready. And there's projects in place. Certainly, everybody probably has heard about starting new 3 Mile Island backup to provide energy to Microsoft. So even the existing technologies, but then the new technologies, there's at least 3 that I'm aware of that have a lot of promise from so not only because they're sort of easier to get set up, quicker to market, but that they have addressed some of the concerns and issues around safety and waste with sort of older nuclear technologies. So we'll have to see. And I think our next question was similar to that. How are things going to change with the new administration? Well, as everyone knows, we have exited again the Paris Agreement, and there has been specific action to separate workers, terminate workers at DOE who are working on climate change, and at the EPA who are working on climate change. So carbon neutrality, I think, is not something necessarily the federal government will be focusing on in the next 4 years, but certainly a lot of states are stepping up, and we're seeing the California rules coming into effect here quickly. So that is for companies over $1 billion, where you have to report scope 1, 2, and eventually scope 3 emissions, as well as prepare a climate risk disclosure. And then companies over 500 million have to do the climate risk disclosure. And that is for any company doing business in California. So if you are selling services or goods into the California economy, then you are subject to that regulation, even if you don't have a physical footprint there. So I'm sure a lot of the companies in the membership are selling into the California market, and we're seeing legislation come through it for New York as well as Colorado that very closely follow the California requirements. And of course, we're seeing, as I mentioned, CBAM in the EU, as well as the CSRD, those are all the state level ones I mentioned, as well as the CSRD is asking for disclosures as opposed to reductions at this point. But that is kind of in alignment with looking at carbon neutrality, being able to get a count on it and, kind of where it's coming from. So those things are still moving forward. The investments that have been made in other areas, such as solar, I think have traction and ideally will continue. And whether or not, I guess, the United States participates in it, those solar and battery prices will continue to come down because there's a lot of momentum there. Okay, do we have any other questions? Okay, so let's see. What is the status of CBAM? So that is, as I mentioned there, I think I mentioned it, they're in a transition right now, or not the transitional, stage. So there are not fees being paid yet, but they are collecting that data. So if you are importing metals either directly or indirectly into the EU, you likely need to provide that carbon footprint or embodied carbon number. France and Italy, well, so as far as CBAM goes, definitely, they are getting pushback on that because it is related to trade. But I would say more near term, we are expecting an omnibus out of the EU, which will impact a lot of the related regulations, so CSRD and potentially CBAM. So the idea of the omnibus is that it's supposed to simplify. There is a lot of talk about it exempting sort of the lower market, so small to medium companies. There is talk about it impacting the deadlines, but we won't know until that comes out. So it should be soon. So keep an eye out for that omnibus, and we'll see if that does impact CBAM. Okay.
Quick question. Is natural gas considered clean energy? Where does natural gas fall in clean energy spectrum?
So that depends on who you ask. But generally speaking, it is cleaner than others, right? So as a fossil fuel, compared to other fossil fuels, it's pretty clean burning. There's still the extraction process that can be pretty damaging. You've probably heard about different detection system satellites that are going and looking for these methane leaks. The Permian Basin, for example, is one of the largest methane leaks that, and that's product. So it's kind of disheartening, like, right, why aren't you capturing that? But it's going straight into the atmosphere as CH4. So, you can think about that bit of it, but on the burning side, it's cleaner to burn than some other things. We talked about the renewable natural gas, which eliminates some of that problem on the extraction point of view, but you can still, there can still be leaks and stuff like that. And so, thinking about using renewable natural gas as a source. Again, it's better than just letting it go into the atmosphere. And as far as the burning of it, it does combust. Its combustion products do include CO2, but it doesn't include, for example, particulate matter or NOx. Some of those other. There's some anyway. Generally speaking, the criteria pollutants, the particulate matter, and they're lower than they would be for coal or petroleum. So but the natural gas industry will tell you that it is. So.
Thank you. Cheyenne, you have your hand up. I will unmute you if you have a question. Yes, I think you're unmuted, Cheyenne. Or you can unmute yourself, I think.
Jane, if you're having problems, you can just put your question in the chat, or feel free to follow up with me as well. Okay. Well, Vijay, thank you very much. Looks like Shane is having a problem unmuting.
Yeah, thank you, Connie. I appreciate it. And this slide deck, we'll make this slide deck available publicly, but like Connie, you mentioned, we will be working on the full report, and it will be going through the review, and our members will have the first priority access to that, and we'll make the decision on a summary report being released more publicly. Thank you all for attending, and if you all have questions or anything MI2 can help you, don't hesitate to reach out to any of us at MI2. We'll be glad to work on what's important for us all. Thank you.
Thank you. And thanks to MI2 for this opportunity. We really enjoyed working with you guys on this.